I am Edward Nersessian. I'm going to introduce Professor Paul Harris, and then he will introduce the other participants of the roundtable. Professor Harris is a developmental psychologist who used to teach at Oxford University for many years. He moved to Harvard 5 years ago. And his latest work is a fascinating book about the imagination of children called The Work of the Imagination, which is available here for those of you who want to buy it, and I'm sure he'll be happy to sign it. Thank you.
Thank you. So I thought we would start off by asking each of the speakers just to talk about their take on children's imagination for a few minutes, and hopefully at that point some themes will emerge and we'll start to explore them. I should mention perhaps that last night it would be hard to say we reached closure. I feel today we're a slightly less heterogeneous group. We're all interested in children. We're all trained in psychology and to some extent clinical issues. And our focus is going to be on children's imagination. And we all like each other. Not that that was... Yeah. And I'm going to invite each person then to speak for a few minutes. So could we begin with Arietta Slade, who teaches here in New York, both as a child psychologist and does clinical work as well.
Okay. I don't need a microphone or anything. Okay. Good afternoon. As difficult as it is to say anything cogent about the imagination in 5 minutes, I decided that the best way to convey the points that I'd like to make is to talk briefly about a child I've been treating, and particularly about his play. Luke, who is now 10, began therapy with me at age 5. He was described at the time by his mother as an animal and a psychopath, and by his father as someone who is not attached to others in the usual way. In many ways, these descriptions, though chilling, were not inaccurate. Luke was violent, volatile, furious, controlling, and sometimes terrifying, to me, actually, caught in the web of his parents' mutual hatred, constrained by his own learning difficulties, social anxieties, attentional problems, and now we think that he may be heading toward a bipolar disorder. But he was and is terribly, terribly bright, in his own way winning and endearing when you're not dodging him, and unusually poetic and articulate about his inner life, although interestingly, rarely with me. When he was 7, his parents began the process of divorcing each other. The devastating and unending fight that was to ensue was focused almost exclusively on one goal: securing the heart and soul of this child. Now I'd like to introduce you to Tiny. This is Tiny. Tiny used to be a very vigorous stuffed animal with all of her stuffing. She used to have eyes. She has been sewn up by me and by Luke's father many times, but this is Tiny in her present form. Beginning at around the time of the divorce, Tiny was the focus of nearly all of our sessions. She had, as I mentioned, all of her eyes, all of her stuffing. She has no eyes anymore. In fact, if you were to hold her, you'd see that all of her stuffing is mostly on my office floor. Now, Tiny is the 8-year-old female child of Sean, who's Luke, and Arietta, who is me. Sean and Arietta are divorced and alternatively hate each other and collude in torturing Tiny. Tiny divides her time between the two houses. Now, what is noteworthy about Tiny is her optimism and good-natured perseverance in tenderly seeking closeness to her parents. She'll often go and say, "Hi, Dad." Now, she never seems to get mad at her parents or retaliates at them for their cruelty, which is amazing in this game. And the only other thing to mention about Tiny is that she has a pooping problem, which is that even though she never gets mad at them, she does poop on them and pee on them all the time, sometimes in their eyes and mouths. Now, most of the play, and this is 3 years, unending, session after session after session, revolves around Sean's, the father's, rage at Tiny, which is unrelenting and extreme. He throws her violently on the floor, slams her into cabinets and walls, stamps on her vigorously, rams objects into her ever-increasing holes and tears, screams obscenities at her, puts her under the leg of a heavy chair, and heaves all of his weight onto the chair. Occasionally, Luke will have Arietta do the same, but for the most part, he who is in every way bent on destroying Tiny, who, as it happens, is remarkably indestructible. This animal has gone home a couple of times when I've sort of had the deluded idea that we'll maintain object constancy by sending the cat home with, but we don't do that anymore because Tiny ended up in the toilet several times, and there's more to say about that, but I'll spare you. There is much to say about the content of this play, the raw and often anal aggression, the replay of the custody struggle and his parents' rage and hatred, which has never in real life actually been directed toward him, as well as his hopeless tenderness and longing for reunion. While certainly some elements of this story are based in internal or external reality, and this is a question I think that some of us thought we might talk about, which is how much is the information informed, the imagination informed by what actually goes on, and how much is it informed by your unconscious, and how much, you can see both of those elements in his story. Many elements of it are not directly derived from his experience. They are fantasies created out of the welter of his rage, helplessness, sadness, and fear. While from a psychoanalytic point of view, we certainly are typically very interested in the content, I would like to make several other comments about this child's play and imagination, and particularly how his play has been colonized and his creativity has been colonized and even stunted by environmental trauma and psychopathology. For Luke, play and imagination are anything but transforming and healing. As his therapist, I feel there is absolutely no way into his play. And as you might imagine, over probably literally hundreds of sessions, I have tried to change the theme, elaborate it, transform the way the characters enact with each other. I've tried, a variety of things. But the play is grimly and relentlessly repetitive, unchanging, unyielding, and compulsive. It has none of the flexibility and mutability of truly imaginative or creative play. Although it is obviously symbolic and representational, it is hardly creative or transforming. In fact, the idea that I've never been able to transform it or change it has been the most frustrating to me as a therapist. His play is also, in a deep sense, incoherent. There is no causal relationship between events and interpersonal exchanges. Pleading for mercy has no impact. Unending violence does not disrupt trust or affection. There are all these things that really don't make any sense about the play. The coherence of the story is to be found in Luke's emotions, but not in the story itself. For many children and for adults, play and fantasy are a way of getting close to other people. They communicate things from one person to another. They're a way of making meaning, even if you're painting a painting as a way of sharing something with other people. In Luke's case, play, constrained as it is by his rigid, violent script, offers us no way, he and I have no way to come together around this or to get closer. And I don't share in his experience other than to feel helpless to change it. Nor does it help us form more of a relationship that will ease his suffering or lead him to form more healing representations. And finally, his play is neither regulating nor containing. As psychologists, we like to think that play ultimately is transforming, containing, regulating, mutative. It feels that this does not function that way at all for him, that it's not solving any problem, it's not bringing him closer to anything. In fact, I think it actually, this play actually adds to his disorganization, a hyperarousal and violence. And I think in some ways it has worn in the pathways of hyperarousal and dysregulation as primary modes of affect expression, rather than using play to create stories and meaning and connection. So I thought the story of Tiny and Luke would give us a way of bringing together a lot of the issues that I know are going to come up.
Okay, well, hold on to that. And maybe if we could ask Marjorie to take up the reins. Marjorie Taylor teaches in Oregon. She's written a wonderful book about children who create imaginary companions. And maybe in some ways, some of those children might be a counterpoint to this narrative. Marjorie.
That was a really interesting narrative, and I assume it's unusual, but anyway, I should...
Yeah, it's in my experience, it's really stuck.
I'm a cognitive developmentalist, and I started interviewing children and their parents about imaginary companions over a decade ago because I was interested in the distinction between fantasy and reality. We often say that children have difficulty with that distinction. I don't really think that's true myself, and I thought that imaginary companions would be a particularly fascinating case, a way to explore children's ability to make the distinction. So I started interviewing children about them, and then I found out there really wasn't much literature out there. There were some there's clinical work, case studies, and Dorothy and Jerome Singer had done some work that indicated that it was relatively normative for children to have imaginary companions, but just really simple questions like how many children have them, who are those children, how are they different from other children, what are the imaginary companions like, is there a typical imaginary companion, are boys and girls different in the way that they do this kind of role play, what's the developmental course, how do children use the imaginary companions to function in their lives. There are a lot of unanswered questions about this phenomenon. So I started interviewing children, and I've probably collected I've probably around 800 or 900 descriptions of imaginary companions right now. So not the case study, definitely a lot of children, and I've really struggled with methodological issues on how to find out about this kind of creation, because it's not that easy or straightforward to find out. So as I have worked on the phenomenon of imaginary companions, I wanted to try to understand better some of the things I was learning about the way children experience their friends. And to do that, I started working with adult fiction writers, because it turns out that adult fiction writers often develop interesting relationships with the characters in their novels. And by interviewing the fiction writers, I was able to get some insights that I brought back to the study with children. So that's what my work has been on for the last many years.
So if we could move to Miriam Steele, who teaches also in New York at the New School. Miriam?
I'm very interested in the writers now, and I've been taken up with that as I was taken up with Arietta's case. I was trained at the Anna Freud Center in child analysis, and also working for many years in the field of attachment, and really trying to bring about some kind of dialogue between those two things. And somewhere along the lines, when Paul asked for me to participate in this roundtable, the word imagination really struck me as being very interesting, in that it's not necessarily a word that's used in either of those domains very often. Play is tremendously, it's the modus operandi really in the world of child psychotherapy, and we use assessments of children's play and look at the themes within children's play, but whether that's necessarily the same as imagination, I think perhaps will be something that comes on board. And one of the features that I've been most interested in is, can we really put children's imagination or play to work as a way of assessing aspects of their internal world? So a child psychotherapist, of course, or analyst would spend a lot of time verbalizing a child's play, looking at the features, and here importantly looking at not just the narrative, not just the words that these children use, but very much what they enact in their play, which can tell us usually a tremendous amount, often more than just the words. For a lot of children in treatment, they don't necessarily have the lexicon for feeling states, or even can tell you about bits of their unconscious or conscious realities in words, but can play them out. And so we've gotten to use something called story STEM assessments, which really bridges these two worlds, I think, in a way that imagination is really at the center of it. And briefly, what we do is we tell the child the beginning and middle of a story, and then ask the child to show us and tell us what happens next. And so here we gain access to both the verbal and the nonverbal. And the story might go something like this. We set out, some of our stories include animal figures, because again, for children, I work a lot with maltreated children, children in adoptive or foster homes, and presenting just a family of dolls is often too close to the bone, and they can't necessarily engage with that. There are a whole other group of children who can't engage engage in play at all and often are brought to treatment for such difficulties. But briefly, the story stems, we set out a story. One of them is a story that we worked on with Jill Hodges at the Anna Freud Center called Lost Pig, where we set out a little family of pigs, and we say one day this little pig goes for a walk, he walks all the way over here, behind all the way over here, uh-oh, he's lost. Show me and tell me what happens next. And here we're actually asking the child to then demonstrate for us what are their strategies, what's in their imagination as a way of getting back to their attachment figures. Do they have anything in mind that will help them get back to where they need to be? Some children, the aggression is the first route. That is, nobody comes or something terrible happens, the pig gets eaten by a crocodile. Other children are really able to use their imagination to make things feel better for themselves. So for example, one little girl said, what you didn't say was on the way to behind the forest, the little pig dropped little bits of bread. And they just followed those little bits of bread and found their way home. Tells us a tremendous amount. It tells us, for one thing, that the pig is depending on themselves. Nobody came looking for the pig, but that they had some sense of realistic mastery in that situation. So it's a way of really gathering elements of their play and thinking about how their imagination might help us understand what's going on, as compared to those children who really obliterate their figures in the play and really tell us that they don't have strategies. They can't make things better through play by putting into an enactment of something that would make them feel better. So we do have sense of aggression, and there I was, thinking really in terms of imagination is that the corollary or not? That we often have aggressive themes, but there's coherent aggression, which we would expect all children to some semblance have. This is not just the realm of the clinical populations, that even securely attached children have some degree of aggression, but it's coherent. It makes sense within a story, versus those children like Arietta's patient, where it's almost can be senseless and doesn't further our aims. And what does a parent do with such a child who keeps forever replaying those themes that occupy their internal world, which are so aggressive and are frightening for the parent to watch? How can we move them along?
And the therapist.
And the therapist. And so really thinking about imagination and how we might use that clinically to assess. And what we gain from a story STEM assessment is that we can look at that child's strategy or the contents of imagination in comparison to the thousands of other children from different kind of clinical samples, which then brings us into a different realm from, say, what a child spontaneously might do in a session with a therapist. And so that gains us a tremendous amount. And so that's my take on imagination and play.
Okay, thank you, Miriam. So let me now introduce Dennie Palmer-Wolf, who directs the research center at Brown, the Annenberg Institute for Social Reform.
Yes, I'm a developmental psychologist who's gone over to the gritty side of real life. The work I do there is basically to encourage communities to think about their children and to plan for them in the same way that they do for lighting, for sewers, for parks, those kinds of things, and to make that a sort of priority. So in terms of public education, in terms of public housing, in terms of the programs that occur both in and outside of school. And I'll come back to that in a moment. One of the great pleasures of having been in the email conversation that went on around this was it allowed me to once again think about these kinds of issues. And in returning to them, I was really struck that across all of us, one of the things that you see is a very different conception of play/imagination from at least the classical or the traditional one, where it's seen as assimilative, largely driven by fantasy, largely about the darker side, the inchoate side, the conflict between desire and rule, between good and evil, those kinds of things. And in fact, perhaps with the exception of Luke, most of us are giving accounts of play as, in fact, one of the most adaptive functions. Imaginative functioning is amongst the most adaptive functions that both young children and, I'd like to suggest, all of us, in fact, have when it functions well. And that, in fact, instead of assimilative, it's very often highly adaptive. Instead of privatized. It's often very social instead, and that the view of it that we have is largely narrative-driven. There may be many more kinds of imagination than that. So I want to suggest that one might think about imagination as the deliberate making of an alternative world or an alternative semantic space. By deliberate, what I mean is that it's chosen, that in its healthy functioning it has both entrance and exit strategies, which you can signal not only to yourself, but to others. Alternative in the sense that it's liberating and often a source of pleasure, in the sense that it's the permission not to be mired in a particular situation. Worlds, I emphasize, because very often what imaginative activity is, as many of these paintings are, an opportunity to remake not just a moment, not just an object, but an entire vision of what it is to be in time and space and in human experience. Plus the fact that I would say that much imaginative activity also is pleasurable. The idea that you can be an agent, that you can make things, is very often also important. But I want to just put two other notions on the table. One is what I'm going to call an imaginative repertoire. We have inherited from both developmental psychology and from, I would say also from clinical traditions, a very particular notion of children's imaginative activity, which is that characterized by small figures or by tiny and the interactions around them. But in fact, if you look at the naturally occurring imaginative behavior of most 3 to 6-year-olds who have these entrance and exit strategies and things, what you see is that, I would argue, what characterizes a rich and healthy and adaptive imaginative life is in fact that children have not only that kind of symbolic play, but they also, for instance, have the ability to remake the actually experienced narratives of their own lives. So the retelling of the day your baby brother was born, in which not he, but you are the star, is also imaginative activity. And that in fact, even very well-functioning children at moments engage in the same kind of play that Luke does. What differentiates them is they have these other options. But that if we think about healthy imaginative development, it would have all of those in it. And that what is distinctive is the ability to use each of those productively and in a sense to choose amongst them. The last thing I want to say is that I think we also have a narrow version of imagination, particularly in childhood, in the sense that we inherited from Freud and others an entirely narrative notion of imagination. I just wanted, I brought my trusty knight, but I want to suggest that there are other forms. This is a knight, belongs to a 3-year-old who has difficulty making him stand up properly on the table. And if you need anything in a knight, you need uprightness. This is a sock hanger. If you put the sock hanger carefully around the foot of the knight, he gains infinitely more stability, more knightliness. And that also is a very important form of imagination, largely nonverbal, largely object-centered. Just to give you another example, a 3-year-old recently moved to Brooklyn, had this object, and he explained that this is the Brooklyn Bridge, this is the Holland Tunnel, and this is the road that gets you to Brooklyn. Now, it's not particularly narrative, but it's a lot about his pleasure at living in Brooklyn. And I just want to, well, he lived in Birmingham, Alabama before that. So. having a Brooklyn Bridge. I just want to end by saying, I think if we were to add this much more sort of embodied kind of imagination to our understanding of it, it would open up a very wide spectrum of phenomena. Just to give an example of that, I have an 85-year-old mother who moved from a house and a garden, both a source of enormous pleasure, to an assisted living. And there, she made contact with a number of other women. She lives in the Bay Area in San Francisco, who are Japanese, and they together engage in ikebana, the arrangement of flowers, leaves, fruits, etc. And it has allowed all of them who once lived in houses, who once marshaled gardens, marshaled children, in the very small confines of a tabletop or a vase, to reimagine a world in which they are agents, in which they are the authors, they are the makers, and can actually invent remarkable worlds on display. And that form of imagination is both as pleasurable and as important as this is.
Thank you, Dennie. Okay. Well, in saying what my own particular stance is, I'd like to connect to two or three of the themes that we touched on yesterday evening and try to set the imagination in a somewhat more biological perspective than we've talked about so far. So if we think about human beings as compared to their close cousins, there's something distinctive about human childhood, which is this phenomenon that we've already touched on, which is pretend play. Particularly joint pretend play is something that's, so far as we can tell, unique to our species. And it's probably important to stress that if that function is not intact, it has deleterious consequences. So if we take, for example, children with autism, one of the key diagnostic symptoms of children with autism is very restricted and not terribly generative pretend play. And we know that comes as part of a larger pattern of difficulty in showing empathy toward other people, sustaining human relationships, and perhaps thinking in larger terms about the future. So there's already a hint that the capacity for pretend play connects to a panoply of other capacities and is distinctively human. Just let me identify two other things which I think flow from the fact that very early on, children in the context of their pretend play show their ability to step outside of current reality and to think about what it would be like to be a different person in a different time and place, which is what we see them doing from about 24 months onwards. I think that capacity connects to two very distinctively human abilities. One was mentioned last night, which is that so much of what we know about the world, or believe we know about the world, is not something that we discover firsthand. These days, much of human science is conveyed to us by experts. Most of human history, obviously enough, is not something that we can experience firsthand for ourselves. Many religious claims are not something we first come by via experience of our own. All of these claims are conveyed to us by other people in the form of often stories or narratives. So in assimilating those stories or narratives, the child is again called upon to think what it would be like to be someone else, stepping outside of his or her current situation and experiencing a different set of events. So what I'm trying to stress here is the fact that human language, if it's to confer the ability to connect with larger humanity, human language has to be connected up with the capacity to imagine, because the capacity to imagine allows us to understand what people are telling us when they tell us, for example, about past times or microscopic entities or possibly the afterlife or prehistory. So children's capacity for pretend play and in some sense their imagination then is absolutely important for a full exploitation of language and testimony. The other point I would like to make is that it's tempting sometimes, particularly if we listen to the narrative that Arietta offered about a child who has a somewhat chaotic play style, to think that play is necessarily divorced from rationality and objectivity, and I don't think that's always the case. There are some important ways in which the imagination and objectivity come together. So let me just highlight two examples. A lot of our causal reasoning, in a lot of our everyday causal reasoning, we ask ourselves how what did occur might not have occurred had the situation been different. We might pose ourselves that question in the context of a relationship that's going wrong. We might pose ourselves that question in the context of an accident that's happened. Even 3- and 4-year-old children do exactly the same thing. When things go wrong, they're able to ask themselves, how might have the past been different so that this would not have occurred? So what I'm trying to say is that our causal reasoning, our ability to analyze what has happened, depends critically on our ability to set aside what actually did happen in the past and to ask what would have happened had things been different. So causal reasoning and imagination are intimately linked. One very similar example, insofar as children are able to make moral judgments, which they do from 2, 3, 4 years of age, typically when they're disapproving of some particular action or saying that something is wrong, what they mean is it could have been otherwise. The normative or appropriate or correct thing to do would have been to do thus and so. And again, here's a very simple everyday illustration of the way in which the child's perception of what did take place is infused by ways in which it could have been otherwise. So our causal thinking and our moral thinking depend upon our imagination. So there are two important ways in which our capacity for pretend play and for imagination in some sense elevates our thinking rather than leads it into irrational paths. Okay, that's me. Now we have so much on the table, I'm not sure where to begin. Arietta, you seem on the brink of saying something, so let me hear from you.
Okay. I was thinking about this idea that causal thinking and moral thinking depend upon the imagination. And I was thinking about trying to, I've lost the words right now, but what you were talking about in terms of Luke. And I guess what I'm saying is that all the productive ways that you all are talking about play, when life in his case, life became unimaginable for him. You know, not unimaginable, but he couldn't figure it out. He couldn't figure out why his parents hated each other so much. He couldn't figure out why he was getting these crazy realities communicated to him through these truly very disturbed parents. And in that sense, his pretend and its chaoticness, its incoherence, its incredibly profound sense that you can't access your attachment figures, you can't be loved. Although he, in some profound way, is loved, but he certainly can't access his attachment figures, is a reflection of how chaotic and incoherent his life experience has been. I mean, he hasn't had the experience that life in some sense makes sense. I mean, it doesn't make any. And once I said to him, I said something like, this situation with your parents, what did I say? Something like, you know, the way your parents are fighting is hard to understand. And he looked at me and he said, it's more than I can understand. And he was 6 at the time. 7, you know, I mean, he really is trying to communicate that he he can't make sense of it. And I think that all these productive functions are not accessible to him because of the way his mind has really been colonized by this conflict.
Right.
For a very long time. You know, he arrives at 6 with that sentiment that it's more than I can understand, because one has a sense then that the kinds of parents who are fighting and having the impact on his mind now, the kind of parent that they would have been when he was a 3-month-old, also would have been a parent that was somewhat confusing or frightening or intrusive, or, you know, looking at imagination within the context of the object relationship. And that's
what I'm trying to say, yeah.
That, you know, then the result is at 6 saying it's more than I can understand, because it's been 6 years of things that are not understandable, are incomprehensible. In that very nonverbal realm, you know, in that early infancy time, where the dance that the mother and the father do with the baby just also doesn't make sense, where there's too much misattunement and there's not enough coherence of affect to grab hold of and bring within the self.
Because this is a mother who described her child at 5 as an animal and a psychopath. I mean, and she wasn't being, she meant it.
And she did experience him that way.
Yeah,
you know,
absolutely.
So he has the capacity to play.
Yeah.
He does have the capacity to play. So do you see that? It sounded that when you first described it as if you didn't see it as a healing, well, you don't see it as healing at all. But is it all he has to deal with the situation in a way? You continue to try to use play. I'm just curious.
But what? Go ahead.
Well, I guess the fact that he can do it seems positive to me, as opposed to not being able to use play at all. It's just the problems are so huge. Does that make sense, or it's just not?
Yeah, I guess I feel like when it gets in this kind of really destructive loop, that it's not anything he's using. It's more an outlet for his unmodulated violence and rage and and everything else, you know. But that it's not functioning like play, or maybe it is functioning like a different kind of play, or.
Yeah.
But it's
so hard to draw the line sometimes between what is normative and healthy and positive, and what is not normal or healthy or positive, because it's a blurry line. I mean, we know that there's lots of themes of violence in everyday play. We know that, children do really worry their parents and what they do in their everyday play with their imaginary mothers and their imaginary companions that get drowned, and, you know, violence and all that sort of thing. So it's often hard to to know what's normative and what isn't. But this is.
But I think that's actually part of what Miriam was saying, is about, you know, the sort of object-related quality. And for those of you who aren't in the analytic world, that means the sort of what does it mean?
Don't look at me.
It means the way you use play to connect to other people and to further relationships. That quality of play, you know, you can have violent play, but it's not within the context of sort of destroying relationships. In this case, it feels like it functions to keep me out, to keep me away, to keep me at a distance, to keep me, in his case, you know, the object of his contempt, you know, because he's very contemptuous toward Arietta in the play.
But I think it raises an interesting point. I once had a little patient who was 5 who couldn't play. And his parents didn't bring him for treatment because he couldn't play. There were all kinds of other things that happened in terms of you know, symptoms that they were worried about that he couldn't learn, so that concerned them, and he was doing some odd bits of behavior at school. But in conversation with supervisors, they were like, well, the first thing you have to do is teach this kid to play, and at least stimulate that area of himself that has been so shut down because of parents who were so intrusive that he kind of gave up on that facility of playing. And so there I did see some kind of developmental line that he felt a little bit further back than Luke, because at least Luke had some of those tools that at least with which to express the aggression and all those things wrong in his world.
I couldn't bump him up.
Right.
That's the whole thing. You know, you hope in treatment that you'll bump a child up to sort of a more, you know, transforming play. Don't make it colder in here, please.
Could I just ask, Arietta, then, you've given an example of a case study in which play as a therapeutic tool is stymied. Do you want to quickly give us an example of a case study where play serves a therapeutic function. I asked that because last night it seemed to me there was quite often the hint that adult play in the form of art also has a kind of therapeutic, organizing, redemptive function. So if you could maybe, I don't know if that's putting you on the spot too much, but if you could offer us a contrasting case, it might be helpful.
I think that optimally you have many, this is a rare example. I sort of use it because it's an example of a situation which is not moving and which is sort of counter to our expectations of what will happen in treatment. And I'm working with another little girl right now who's also very rigid and controlling and angry, but and I've worked with her and her mother together, and you can just the way she includes her mother in the play and the way she organizes the play around her mother and around me, and I play in this case. I'm usually put in the position of playing her, but the way it's hard to do quickly, but. From one session to the next, from 1 week to the next, from 1 month to the next, even though we may get mired in her usual dramas, they change. They change, and the characters change, and what they say changes, and how they solve things changes, and the quality of this is its inflexibility of Luke's play, as opposed to a child. And I think this is we don't look for play when we're working therapeutic with children that isn't violent, or that isn't aggressive, or that isn't full of emotion. That's not the issue. It's how it gets organized, how it gets negotiated within the relationship with the therapist, if the parent is in the room, how it gets negotiated with the parent, and how the play itself develops. That's usually we have word we haven't used yet, is develop. And you expect play within a therapy to develop in a myriad of ways, The relationships between the characters will change, the materials the child uses will change, the kinds of stories they tell about the materials will change. And I think that, happens hopefully 90% of the time.
But I'm curious, because I was really struck when you said, Luke said, it's more than I can understand. Mm-hmm. So this is not someone who is completely paralyzed by any... So it suggests that these different modalities of understanding. And I'm curious, back to this notion about a whole repertoire. If you and Luke ever build something for Tiny,
that would be such a nice idea.
No, that there are possibly other modalities in which he's more organized about these same, and that Tiny may have become a certain part of his repertoire.
Right, with me. It's his repertoire with me.
Right.
Because he goes to his medicating psychiatrist and talks volumes. Blah, 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 blah. My mother, my father, yes, my mother's telling me this, and my father's telling me... I'm like, what's wrong? I only get the abuse, but there's obviously all kinds of reasons for that. Good ones, I'm sure. So his repertoire in the treatment has become very limited. No, that's an interesting question, because I actually think that it's the fact that play is physical and is potentially full of enactment that is so difficult for him. When he can actually be, he will not talk to me about this stuff, but he will talk to somebody else about it. And when he's not going into the room and playing in this physical way, he can contain it much better, which is a really interesting.
Yeah, because so often the presumption is what we see there is the repertoire, as opposed to having and these two.
But it's such an interesting thing that within a transference relationship or within a therapeutic relationship, this is the modality that has gotten entrenched, And I could say more, but I think it's really an interesting issue.
Could I just make a distinction between two ways, though, in which you might be using play? Because you're making a distinction between, a very sharp distinction between these two cases. Could it not be that, insofar as they bring such differences to the play environment, the setup, that play is merely serving as a way for you to detect those larger differences. That would be one fairly simple possibility, but I think you're hinting at something else. You're hinting at that in the second case, the possibility of being able to engage in play is a transformative experience in and of itself. Now, what's the evidence for that? Is there anything other than your own therapeutic experience? I mean, do you see what I mean or not?
No, I guess I don't, because I mean I think that's sort of the prevailing expectation of play in therapy, is that we'll have that.
Yes, and I'm saying, but why are you persuaded that in the second case, what's really transformative is the opportunity to play, rather than larger issues that are changing in the child's life? I mean, the play may just be a mere epiphenomenon of some larger changes, even though one's tempted as a clinician to think that the play arena itself is in some sense the key through which you make changes, or via which you make changes.
Well, I think in that situation, which I haven't gone into any detail about, I've actually worked very hard on all the external changes as well, you know.
In the second case or the first case?
The second case. I've tried in the first, but it's been absolutely hopeless because the parents are not amenable. But in the second, they're quite amenable, and the school's been amenable. And you know, so that in fact there are external changes going on. All the major external changes have gone on.
And you don't know in the first case how much worse it would have been had he not had this opportunity to be
I
with,
suppose that's true.
To be with you and to play this out over and over again. That's driving you crazy. True. But you know, without that, you know, would they put him in some therapeutic community or, you know, somewhere much worse than somehow they're containing? They are containing him.
No, he's doing much better. It's been very frustrating as his therapist, but he's doing much better.
But that is interesting, that how play can be that irritating. You know, that it does need to change.
Upstairs. I'm not fantasizing about it. There is somebody upstairs making noise.
And then
we're all bad.
Oh, okay. Okay, Miriam, excuse me.
That's fine. I was probably the one.
It's my imagination.
It's your imagination run amok. Yes. But there is a sense of, you know, why is that? That is it just because we need change to happen within play for us to feel like we're doing our job, and that repetitious quality to it is very, very irritating. And that is it because we don't sense the progress that we're demanding?
But see, I think there's some element of his imagination that will never progress as long as his mind is wrapped up in trying to figure out whether his parents are going to be killing each other and whether he can stop it. And if not, is he going to be killed in the process? I mean, I feel that's where all of his mental energy is going. And that until they stop actually being at war, which may be never, a huge portion of his mind is going to be co-opted into that battle. So he's doing better, but on a relative scale. I mean, he's still this close to being thrown out of school, you know. I mean, Tiny's not the only one who's the object of his aggressiveness. I mean, he's, you know, gotten kids in the eye with a pencil at school. I mean, he's, you know.
But it could be that he does get to the point that he does get to the point of saying it's them and not me. You know, I remember Miriam Radke had this very interesting study of children with parents who were bipolar, very, very, very ill. And from our attachment perspective, one would have thought that the children who are securely attached have the best prognosis. And in her case, it was the children who were insecurely attached, who were avoidant of the crazy mind of the mothers, that did the best. So I always like to present that data, and it was, you know, the kid who would say, I'm out of here, I'm going to play basketball outside, and imagined a different reality, saying, I can't enter into her craziness, it's about her and not me, that was a sign of health. And so when one looked at their relationship, it looked rather avoidant, and you know, these children were connected in the way that we would like them to be to a caregiver, but given the crazy mind of those caregivers, this was the best choice forward. So that whether he could get to that point of reining in some resilience from somewhere and extracting the bit of good that he can get from you or wherever else, and say, she's crazy, he's crazy, they're both crazy, I need to move.
But
he can't do that yet, but maybe he's 10? 10. He needs to do it quick.
Could we perhaps open it up a little bit? I mean, thematically at the very least, and gradually we want to draw in the audience. One of the things that's echoed in the presentations that we've made, I think, is the following possibility or claim, and it's that when you, and I think it's a standard clinical assumption, that when you watch a child in pretend play, you're getting a glimpse of the child's larger, realistic experience.
Non-clinical.
You're shaking your head already, but let me just finish, and then you can shake it even more vigorously. But I guess what I'm driving at is the fact that let's take the story stem setup. You tell the child a story and you ask the child to finish this story. The assumption is that this imaginative completion by the child gives you some kind of window on what the child's actual emotional life is like. If you take the AII, the adult attachment interview, in some sense, you assume when you engage in that interview that the reconstruction and narratives of those experiences is in some sense giving you a handle on what that person's mode of handling actual relationships is like. So in this way, the tools that we're using seem to be fairly tied to the person's characteristic ways of construing relationships in reality. And yet, when we think of the kind of fiction writers, for example, that Marjorie interviews, we think of those fiction writers as being able to step outside in a pretty dramatic way their characteristic ways of dealing with other people. It's not as if we read Shakespeare and say, gosh, given the way he describes Iago, he clearly we just don't do that. So to what extent are we, partly because of the clinical history of research on pretend play and its therapeutic function, being a little bit restrictive of our take on children's imagination, because we're not offering the opportunity to be a bit more creative. I
think that assumption is wrong, and maybe other people in the room. I moved my mic down so I wouldn't be. I don't know if other people in the room would agree with this, but Miriam, as both a researcher and a clinician, I just wonder if you think this is right. But I think the assumption within psychoanalysis is that the child's play is reflective of an internal reality and not necessarily at all an external reality. That it's really about the child's unconscious fantasies, which may have nothing to do with actual real experience. And that's, I think, a guiding assumption in classical analytic theory. And these assessments, well, maybe you want to talk about the assessments, but they're structured assessments that are very different from the play you get in a session, which is not directed in any way. I mean, I don't know how you...
But I think Paul was very careful in what he said, that I think he wasn't saying that the play that you get is a reflection of real experiences, but of their evaluations of those experiences. And so I think he was then choosing his words very carefully, or at least I stood in awe of his careful choice of words, as I often do. Someone once said of Paul that he can order breakfast and impress you with his English accent.
The breakfast note.
With the English accent. It was somebody who overheard you order breakfast at an SRCD meeting who said, yes, those English accents, they just, he orders breakfast, and it's impressive. But I think that's the careful key, that the evaluations or the representations are then both conscious and unconscious and have, of course, something to do with the real experiences, but the way in which those have been internalized by the child. And then it's the whole realm of imagination and unconscious processes. But from some, that they are in part derived from actual interactions at some level and then flourish within the mind, of the child, in that way. But the thing, the reason that we're so, I think, attracted to the story STEM assessments is because if you're just waiting for some of these issues to arise in play spontaneously, you sometimes have to wait a very long time. And then what the story STEM assessments allow us to do is to pick the child up and put them in 13 different places, and then look at what the child does in terms of features of play that you wouldn't be able to grasp in the same way if you're just waiting. Well, what happens when they see, parents fighting with one another? How do they get out of that scenario? What are the elements of play that come forth? If you're just waiting for that, you might have to wait a very long time.
Dennie.
Yeah, I actually worked on the story stems, and there are 13 different places. But within the course of 13, I think you can see children change what I'll call their sort of stance towards a story. So you'll get some that kids respond to in a script-like fashion. Well, when you get lost, you have to then call for somebody. And it's in the second person, it's highly generalized, it's often very rooted in reality, and it's not emotionally nuanced. Others that, for various reasons, capture an issue. Kids engage in much more the way we think of as sort of typical therapeutic play. Others, particularly those at the end of the sequence, when kids are exhausted at having been put down in 13 different highly stressed places, look much more like Luke. They are wilder, they are incoherent, the emotion has a kind of eruptive quality. So that I think this particular way of viewing what is being represented is much too narrow. And in fact, if you look carefully at the transcripts from those story stems, there are both action and linguistic markers for being in those different sorts of narrative realms. And I think in a way, it's very important to look at the pattern for a particular kid, but that in the 13 or so, she or he can be in very different places. And we have to learn, I think, how to take those different kinds of play very differently. Because they do, I think, have different sign-signifier relationships, different emotive contents, and some of them are absolutely about not engaging in the emotional content. So those scripts are about, I'm not talking with you right now about being lost. I'll tell you what in general people do when they get lost. But
I think with Imaginary Companions, it's all about what's going on in children's lives. And you see sort of a parallel life going on in the lives of the Imaginary Companions. So one little boy, when he got a bowl of fish, his imaginary friend got a tank of sharks. And in fact, everything that happened to this child, it was bigger and better and more grandiose in the life of the imaginary friend. If there's somebody sick in the family, you might have a sick imaginary friend that has to be looked after. If somebody dies, one child had the dog of her imaginary friend die the time that her grandparents' dog died, but in the case of the imaginary friend, the dog could come alive again. It goes on and on. You see the themes that are of interest to children that are happening in their lives. If you want to know what's on the child's mind, often it's going on with the imaginary friend. And I often ask parents if they've talked to their child about how the child thinks about the people who moved in next door with the big dog, and how does the imaginary friend think about the big dog. And lots of times children will say, well, the imaginary friend is really scared of that, I'm not, or the imaginary friend is afraid he's going to go down the drain, but I'm not, and that sort of thing. So there's a lot of communication going on about the child's real concerns. At least that's the way it appears to the parents who are telling me about these events. So from my point of view, it's all linked up with what's on the mind of the child at that time, and it's sort of a running narrative about the life of the imaginary friend and what happens in that life.
What about children who create these larger so-called paracosms, these more complicated worlds? Isn't that an example of where, in some sense, they surely are stepping outside of everyday life?
Sure. One of the problems with this area of research is whatever generalization you make, there's going to be a counterexample because it's all over. The diversity with what children do with their friends, what the friends are like, how many are there? Is it a whole world populated with creatures with their own language and religion and money and everything? I mean, some children go into this very dramatic and elaborate and sometimes shared fantasy about another world, which is the paracosm. But for some children, it's just your buddy that's, going through your life with you, and like Calvin and Hobbes, I suppose. I mean, there are a lot of real-life Calvin and Hobbes, and you discuss the things that are going on in your life with your friend, and your friend has opinions. You listen to what they have to say. So it can be quite different than the imaginary world of paracosm.
What is paracosm?
The paracosm is the whole imaginary world, rather than just having...
So the Bronte sisters, for example, apparently created one for several years.
Yeah, so the Sylvia and Keith.
I was going to say
Harry Potter, that whole...
Yeah, true.
Can I shift our gears to another topic, or a topic, again, trying to bridge back to last night? I mean, we've been talking, I think, for the most part, about children roughly between the ages of 2 and 7. Your patient is a little bit older now. But a lot of the research, of course, focuses on the preschool years and the imaginary companions. The alleged high season is the preschool years, although, again, they persist. We haven't, when we were communicating before this meeting, none of us really talked about the development of the imagination. How does it change, and what's the difference between a child and an adult?
Well, this is something I was really interested in because I thought that imaginary friends would be finished by the time children start school, because that's sort of accepted wisdom. And I wanted to find out what had happened to them. And what I found out was that the 7-year-olds that we interviewed, they were just as likely to have an imaginary friend as the 3-year-olds. And in fact, there was no developmental change in the incidence of having an imaginary friend, although the form changed a little bit. So the younger children were more likely to have a personified object, so a tiny that they animated instead of having an invisible friend, where the older children were more like, most of them had invisible friends. So then I started realizing that other people had talked about imaginary friends at age 10. There's some work with 14-year-olds in Germany who write diaries, and a lot of the diaries are addressed to an imaginary friend. And then I started realizing about what was going on the internet and and live-action role play, which is apart from the internet, which can involve imaginary friends, imaginary characters, or taking them on as well as interacting with them. And I've come to think of this inclination to interact with imaginary others as something that's there from a very surprisingly early age. Why would children start talking to invisible dolphins when they're 2.5? I mean, they have enough on their mind, right, really, just to learn about the real world. Why invisible dolphins? And it seems to just morph into different kinds of activities rather than going away. And this is what brought me to fiction writers, because I thought they would be sort of an expert, or they were engaged in activity that at least had shared some characteristics with what was happening in early childhood. So I have this feeling of they're changing in form, but it's still there a lot, although the capacity to pretend has a real developmental change. And so what you can use as a symbol in pretend play, whether it has to look like a telephone in order for you to talk into it, pretend to talk into it, or can it be a banana? Right. That changes with age, but this capacity to create and interact with imaginary others seems to be, I think it's lifelong, actually.
So you're emphasizing deep continuity.
I am.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is, to some extent, this notion that sort of in latency, things become very stolid. But I would very much agree with you that it changes in form, but not in impulse or in frequency or in...
Miriam, do you have a take on this issue?
Well, I got caught thinking, that there is almost this instinctual need to kind of project outside, so it is, bits of oneself as a way of interacting, and then you have full control over the character that you're interacting with, in a way that if they're a real person, you just don't have that. And I was thinking of an adolescent girl who was an inpatient where we did the adult attachment interview, and she had a horrific history. Her father was a pedophile and engaged with her in a pedophile ring, and she was quite coherent about the nature of those experiences. This was quite a while ago in England, and she said that one of the things that helped her a lot was a photo on her wall of Mick Jagger. And that she used to talk to this photo, and she used to have long conversations and would ask herself, could Mick Jagger possibly fall in love with someone who shoplifted like the other girls on her floor would? And she decided no. Whenever I mention this, people say, no, probably he would rather fall in love with someone who could shoplift. But it was this then imaginary figure of sorts,
sure.
And that there was no real relationship there. But for her, it was incredibly mutative. I mean, there wasn't any real person around with whom she felt she could actually have this kind of internal, external kind of conversation in that way. And then my other association, again from the clinical realm, I was teaching a class in developmental psychopathology at the New School to the Lang students, so undergraduate students, and we had a session on eating disorder, and they said, well, do you know how much there is on the internet? And apparently there's kind of a group phenomena of imaginary, I don't know what one would call it. They aren't for them, they're friends. It's you put in, if any of you would like to Google ANA, A-N-A. There are 650,000 sites where you write and engage with this imaginary, but it's a group phenomenon because all these girls are and these are ways of facilitating your anorexia. So diet tips, things you would tell your parents, tell them you're going to a restaurant and make sure you walk by and look at the kind of food that's there so you can report back. So it's kind of this group imaginary friend type, and that it's very compelling for these girls. And they talk a little bit with one another, but it's mainly to this ANA, A-N-A, short form for anorexia, and the friend that you need to make with her, and how she's the only one who understands you. Oof. And all of it then sounds very imaginary, companion-like, but it's on this massive scale. 2 citations in Spanish, the rest English. So it's a Western phenomena, but it was shocking. And how many of the undergraduates, they all knew about it. It was, I was the one who was more shocked than they were familiar. So the group phenomena of using an imaginary friend or imagination in this way to give something back that you're not getting from the real people in your world.
Dear Abby.
Yeah, Dear Abby.
Dear Abby.
But this one's really telling you what to do.
Yeah, but I'd spent...
Yeah, but it's that kind of phenomena.
Did you want to say something? No. I mean, one of the things that I thought about when I was thinking about children's absorption in pretend play and the way that it might change was the following speculation. So I'd be intrigued at your reactions. It seems to me that what you typically see is children's not just absorption but emotional reactivity to what it is that they've created, be it a monster or a fight or a problematic family or whatever. So if anything, this known to be fantasy by the child is nevertheless as engaging to some extent as real life. But of course that phenomenon is something we see in adults too when they read a novel or go to the theatre or engage in go to a film. But what seems different about us as we get older, as compared to a child, is that we can use that knowledge that this is mere fantasy to regulate a little bit more our reaction to this imagined world, whereas the child seems more readily carried away and caught up. Now, if anything, you could perhaps push that even further. Apropos a remark that my wife made last night, we were talking about the fact that as adults, there are many aspects of life that one can entertain, imagine, and think through, whether it's getting older or problems with one's children or all that the future holds, so to speak. But one does not deliberately and actively imagine all of those possibilities, partly because one's aware of the emotional dangers that those representations and imaginations activate. So one of the stories of the imagination, I suppose, is that we learn to switch it off. We learn to dampen it down, and we don't explore some of the horrors that we know are out there. And young children have less skill or less robustness in that kind of self-denial.
Yeah, I would argue that while it may not be like an adult's, that young children's ability to regulate and to make those kinds of distinctions is surprisingly sophisticated. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, these conversations you can have with a 2.5-year-old about if you were to be scared by something, or a very inhibited little girl we were working with the story stems who would not engage in play, found it far too risky. Her father saying to her, you know, if you were going to play, show me and tell me what happens next. So, I mean, this, all kinds of modulating regulatory sort of rims around the play very early. I think when when the play escalates or when it touches on something dangerous,
they stop.
Yeah, but that happens to us when we go to a movie. We can't.
They change it. The monster is a baby monster, and its teeth have all fallen out.
Right.
Yeah,
That's right.
That's
right.
So you're hinting that I'm underestimating the regulatory abilities of young children.
Yeah, I think.
Yeah.
Or on the other hand, you know, the ways in which adults play, and you know, the sort of the mass scales in which they play. So, in a few weeks' time, people will be watching apparently the Super Bowl in a big way.
Some of us will.
Some of us will be. It's been the currency at home how that's all going to happen and who you get together with to watch this. But there was this article, I'm not sure if Oliver's still here, he probably knows about it more than I do, in the New York Times about mirror neurons. And they mentioned there that that's, you know, what it is. That's how, when we imagine, when we're watching, you know, a football game of, you know, either sort, a soccer or football game, that we're somewhere caught up in the fantasy, and our minds are actually going along with that. They are actually, those neurons are actually firing as if we were engaging in that, you know.
But only some of us are having those fantasies.
Only, well, the millions who are watching on those weekends.
Enjoying watching.
That's right.
Yes.
But Dennie, you know, mentions what happens when you go to a movie, but there is that capacity then of letting yourself completely be engaged like a child in play. And I think, you know, all of our stereotypes of groups of men watching the Super Bowl or watching the football is there is a childlike quality of really just becoming so engrossed that it does mimic very much, and that now we have this physiological evidence that that's what goes on in the mind. You know, it is.
But I think Arietta was hinting that there are actually mirror neurons that are dedicated to American football. Some of us may or may not have them.
Right. Well, and some of us who are American don't have them.
Right.
But
Truly not patriotic.
right, I guess it's true. Those of us who are unpatriotic. I forgot what I was going to say. I started thinking about football. It'll come back.
Obliterates the imagination.
It obliterates exactly how I feel watching football, but.
But that does feel like a new exciting realm. Linda Mays talks a lot about the neurological changes over time that very much coincide with changes in play and changes in development. That, you know, there are, you know, the way the mind changes really then helps us understand why, for example, children below 3 fail at theory of mind tasks and then they get it, apart from the autistic children. But that there are, you know, there are features that develop over time and that we can find, you know, brain development that very much helps us understand how that might come to be. So that, you know, a person can think of, you know, be thinking this way, but we also know that other times they're thinking that way. That those sort of complex kind of cognitive substrates go along with neurological development.
But so are you just saying, well, the imagination changes insofar as it were, the background cognitive system becomes more sophisticated, or are you saying there's some changes specific to the imagination?
Or that, you know, the geography of the mind is so complex that those things are all going hand in hand.
Right.
But probably yes, and that those artistic geniuses, or the child who can play in a wonderful way, that there is something quite compelling about what's going on in the background of the mind in a way that a child who can't quite play in that way, one would also presumably be able to pick up at some point.
There's also the inclination to engage in some kind of imaginative play, pretend play, and I think maybe that's something that stays constant. Maybe that's what I'm talking about, staying constant, that you're interested in doing that and you participate in that kind of activity. And of course, as you grow older, you have more resources and are able to do it in more sophisticated ways. You don't need as many props and that sort of thing, or need to act out things yourself. But the inclination to interact with imaginary others is there.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, please.
I'm not a child person. Adults I can understand. But I analyzed a person who had 3 imaginary friends as a child. And it became clear after some time in the analysis that their names, which I was going to ask you about, whether you asked the names of the imaginary friends and what they could mean, their names translated into one had a penis and 2 did not. And this was because he was a boy and he had 2 sisters that were born after him. And a lot of the play involved the one with the penis with the 2 without penis. And as an extension of that, he created a whole world where he ruled this country, and his sisters played with him in this game. And as part of his being the ruler, he insisted that the youngest sister was a boy. And not only she was a boy, she was a star baseball player. Mm-hmm. So everything happened around this imaginary country with all of the things that he imposed. He grew up to become a list maker and become passionate about Wagner. And he called his room in his home Valhalla, and he always, every time there was a performance of Wagner, no matter where of the Ring, he went to see it, and he always he refused to listen to go or to listen to any other kind of opera, and always listened to the Ring in the correct order. He would never tolerate listening to something spontaneously. So in terms of the transformation of that early imagination, and in this case imaginary friend, this is what took the place. The Ring took the place of the country that he had as a child. The imaginary friends as such disappeared, but he became an avid list maker, collecting data about all sorts of things. And the fact of the names was very important for me in terms of understanding his conflicts, which is why I think I was asking you about that.
Yeah, well, I ask their names, I ask what they look like, I get the children to draw them. I have a lot of drawings of imaginary friends. The names are interesting. You wonder sometimes where they come from, like Nutsy and Nutsy, which those are the names of 2 brightly colored birds. One's a boy and one's a girl, but they have the same name. Sethrophina, which the child corrected the researcher many times to make sure the researcher got it right, Sethrophina. Elfie Welfie and Sammy Whammy, Mrs. Duck, Shark the Shadow, Mr. Ghost, Snobby, Gadget, little mouse that sits on your shoulder. So they're all over the map.
I think one of the good things about psychoanalysis is it allows you to get to the meaning of those names.
Yeah, well, sometimes they're more informative. Like, for example, one child had an imaginary friend named Dammit, and she wasn't very nice. She was not a very nice little girl. And they can have, I think Dorothy and Jerome Singer talk about imaginary friends named Fina and Barbara Tall. Okay, so Fina and Barbara Tall, which the child must have heard about Fina Barbara Tall. So they pick up things that they hear that capture their fancy, and it might be just something like hearing a Dr. Seuss book about was it in the closet, and start thinking, whoa, is there a was it in my closet? And then was it comes out of the closet, turns out was it's okay, and is your imaginary friend. So the names come from all over the place, and lots of times it's just something that children play with, and then they move on to other things. It's not something that's going to dominate their lives in the way you're describing them.
This is a good moment, I think, to open up. Yes, please.
I was wondering if you could talk a bit about symbolizing, because I was thinking about, I have a granddaughter who's kind of hard to talk yet, but if I give her a little cup, I can take a sip, and I go, she takes the sip, and she goes, and so that Arietta, she knows what she's doing, and she knows she's not doing it, but we're doing it imaginatively. And so I'd just be interested in having you talk a little bit about how imagination and the ability to symbolize is related, because it sounds like one of the things with Luke is that he can do this imaginative stuff, but there's nothing symbolic about it. But it's not symbolizing.
Well, it's highly symbolic, because in fact it's a replica of the way it's a symbolic representation of the way he feels vis-a-vis his parents.
It's not symbolic in the sense that it's transforming or creative, but to answer your question,
I'm interested to hear more talk about that.
I mean, it's funny because, I think certainly the three of us spent many years looking at exactly that kind of moment with little children, and Piaget, was really the first person to talk about it. But, children start at about 16 or 18 months old to do that very simple, short, little symbolic sequence. That is, they obviously know that they're pretending at drinking. Usually they're doing it around their own body. They're using a little comb to pretend to comb their hair. And then shortly, your grandchild will start to play out these little scenes amongst, not on her body, but amongst little dolls or little truck. And then the next step will be that she'll pick up a cup and turn it upside down and say that it's the house for the doll. But that's a very well-documented sequence in normal children that, most children start to do at around 16 months, and it goes on in that form until they're about almost 3. I don't know what you...
Well, I would just say that one of the classic cognitive developmental positions was taken by Piaget, who saw pretend play as one symbolic function among several. So in what got translated as Play, Dreams and Invitation in English, but was La Formation du Symbole in French, was essentially a developmental analysis of the interconnected development of several symbol systems, language being the primary, pretend play being another one, and imitation being a third. So for Piaget, there were several streams that were roughly concurrent. Now there might be dissent from that these days, but at least that's a classic position. Yeah.
But I think the other thing you point out, which is so important and that we often forget about it, is how social it is. Mm-hmm. When we construe it as sort of this projective activity only, we leave out of it how much joint activity there is, how much mutual checking there is, how much mutual pleasure there is in the joke. And so that this notion of imaginative activity as interior as opposed to shared, I think is sort of taken apart by just that example that you give.
And people are wondering, what are the cues that help children figure out that you're pretending to drink, not that you are mistakenly trying to drink out of an empty cup, but you're pretending. And it turns out that there are specific cues like sound effects, smiles, looks that make it different from an act where you reach for something and get a drink and there's nothing in the cup. And children are able to pick up on those cues, and developmental psychologists are interested in how they're able to do that. Because it's very sophisticated in some ways, that they can look at this act and understand that it's not meant to be serious.
We have a question back there, yes.
Yeah, the names of the imaginary friends got me wondering about something, which is the impact of media on imagination in children, especially given the extent to which it's generally agreed that children are more and more suffused in media every day. And so it'd be interesting to know whether there's any research or thinking on, as children are more media saturated, is their imaginary world and imagination ability changing? I just think this is a pretty important thing I'd like to hear you discuss.
There's a new book. Yeah, there's a new book called Imagination in the Electronic Age that just came out last year that really addresses that, and it's by the Singers, and they are saying that they think that it's not devastating to the imagination, that it's opening up new opportunities. And I would say that in my work, what I see, people think, well, maybe children are just taking characters to populate their lives that are given to them in stories, like the example I said of Was It, or The Little Mermaid, or whatever, taking those characters, and they're not making up idiosyncratic ones like they used to. But I'm not seeing evidence of that. It's surprising to me how out of the blue most of these companions are, that they don't have, they're not, some of them are Little Mermaid and Batman, but a lot of them are ones that you'll, like Sethrafina, that they don't come from anywhere. They're sort of very creative and unusual. I could never think of them up, like Elfie Welfie, who's this little tie-dyed person who's a veterinarian, and she's this tall. Where'd that come from? I mean, I'm very impressed with children's ability to be creative and generative, and I just learn about new imaginary companions all the time. It's quite astonishing, actually, what children can come up with.
It has a huge amount to do with how the media enter kids' lives. People often make the distinction between film and movies. I mean, film, we're supposed to be, avidly engaged in and have an argument driving home about. Movie, you can just. But I mean, the same is true of kids. I mean, if you're engaged in any of the fantasy software games or something, it can be quite rigid and repetitive. It can, in fact, be a whole world, a whole universe. And so it has, we also tend to think about media entering kids' lives in this kind of, as an external, unmodulated force. But in fact, in a lot of families and amongst siblings, between parents and kids, as much modulation goes on around that. It's, may have gone on around Hans Christian Andersen, or the things we think of as the treasures of childhood in a world unsaturated by media. So I think it really behooves us to think about under what conditions does it revoke imagination, and under what conditions does it stimulate imagination.
Please.
This may just be a semantic quibble, but I actually wanted to ask any or all of you to elaborate on a distinction that I think it was Miriam who first made between the term play and the term imagination as they apply to children. And I think your premise was that we do tend in common parlance to talk more about play in children than about imagination. If that's true, is it because we want to reserve the term imagination for a population that no longer believes in Santa Claus? In other words, it makes more sense to you credit imagination with greater achievements if it's pitted against the reality principle. I mean, if you know, in fact, that you're imagining, that it's a willing suspension of disbelief, and I don't know, that's where I'm at.
And my thoughts about it was that, because we've talked all about play, but, we use, say, a children's drawing. Mm-hmm. Drawing your, is that not imagination? Or that the reason that we veered so much towards play is that that's something that we can look at because it's on the outside. And imagination is that whole other world that is so much on the inside that we can't gain access to unless it's displayed in some form, verbal or nonverbal. It's got to be out there for someone else to see it. But all the thoughts and fantasies about Santa Claus coming and what he's going to bring, and all of that you don't even, it doesn't even get to the point of being expressed. We just have so little access to that it became less interesting for perhaps the field of developmental psychology or even the psychoanalytic community that it's there, but it's way out of reach, and so we don't know what to do with it in the same way. But when one constructs, what the meaning making that happens, say in a session or in being with someone else, it's then our imagination alongside the other person's imagination, but it has to be put on the table somehow, and I think that's where we went. But because I was a bit worried, I think, imagination. I have a lot of things to say about that. And then when I started, no, I can think about play, but I can't think so clearly about imagination. That it is in this rather idiosyncratic, erratic, it's somewhere else. That makes it exciting as well. Can our imaginations meet up in this third place and share something? So when we look at art of various kinds, it's that space that has words but doesn't have words that's quite exciting, and we're driven to. And that's why I like that mirror neuron bit, because it did show something of this inclination or almost this instinctual need we have to play. And to engage with other people's imagination that makes, as Paul was saying, it's a human thing. It's perhaps not, that we are the only ones who need to do that. And we put a lot of emphasis that. So, grandmothers are notoriously very excited, or parents are very excited when their children for the first time show some sign of symbolic play. That's a moment. It's like the first step. It's like talking. It's a something. I think we put a lot of emphasis on, they took that piece of paper and they pretended it was a cup or whatever it is, is a real developmental moment for us, because I think it then says, hey, they're here with us, we can play, we can imagine together.
It makes me think about someone like Melanie Klein,
who needed very little evidence. I think, and I certainly think that represents not a particularly strong American tradition within psychoanalysis, but to some extent, that you needed very little evidence to attribute something to the the play was less important than what you imagined it meant, and what you imagined it was linked up to in the child's imagination. And I think if you look at the history of psychoanalysis, I think for a long time the external manifestation was less important than the belief about the internal, which I think often was incorrect, but that's a whole other discussion. But I think we've gotten more rooted in the relationship between reality and fantasy, and we've gotten more interested in the external manifestations. But I think in the past you didn't need too much of anything to make speculations about what was
about
inside.
What the 2-month-old was.
Right.
She does.
I'm opposed to speculation, but I wouldn't say that the external would really necessarily take priority. It is one of the factors involved. The internal and the external are always in a constant interaction. The case of the person I presented, why would you think that he would have such a strong reaction to the fact that 2 girls were born after him? That was the external, the fact that there were 2 girls and they didn't have a penis. But for him, this was a major event for which he had to create this whole. So the internal consistently influences the external, and the external consistently influences the internal. I think that would be more the psychoanalytic view, I would say. And I don't agree with Melanie Klein. I think that's fanciful thinking.
No, but I don't either at all, and I certainly ascribe to your point of view, but I think I just wanted to use that as an example of.
But it is very interesting then that back in the 40s and 50s, that they were much more willing to be imaginative to some degree and not base it all that much on external, features, reality really, and that all kinds of theoretical notions came up in terms of, that were quite fanciful. Melanie Klein is but one, and that they were very bold.
I believe the hallucinated breast is a concept that is well established, and
and a lot of people believe it still.
Right,
but
I know.
I would still say, though, that even if the balance, the extent to which we're willing to go beyond the external signs and speculate about what's going on internally, it's still the case that a great deal of developmental psychology and developmental psychological work about the imagination takes play as its starting point. And I think, whilst that's fine up to a point, I also think it's very limiting, because there are many aspects to the imagination which are not manifested in play. I tried to make that point at the beginning, but it's interesting that even we, eclectic and adroit as we are nevertheless talking a great deal about pretend play. Yes, question over there.
Yes. About imagination and privacy. And I was wondering if you experience any cases where children use their imaginary friend as something private, or what difficulty you had. Did you ever experience yourself as intruding on people and trying to find out? And I'm just wondering different functions to which they may be put. I mean, there's one that you were describing, the communicative function, where you say, well, I'm not the one who's afraid, but Mary over here is. But I was just wondering whether there are others which the child would be very reluctant to share the fact of the existence or much about it, or different modalities in which imaginative creatures might be used, some for communication and play, but others for very private things. I'm just curious what your experience has been.
My experience is that children want to tell you all about their pretend friends, and that I think one reason why a lot of developmental psychologists have not taken up this area is because they believe that children might not want to share the private fantasy of a disturbed child. That's really the stereotype. It's still out there, and that stereotype. And when you see an imaginary friend in a movie or in a play, there's usually something wrong with the child, and it's a private kind of thing. But most of the time, children really want to tell you about the current imaginary friend. They may not want to tell you about the old one. So if it's gone, I had one little boy say, he was defective. And so there's that sort of thing. But I have not found, and I've asked parents, so when you engage in play with your child around the imaginary friend, how does the child react? And really, almost across the board, they say with delight. Their children really like that. So we haven't found that at all, that children really want to tell us about it. They will tell you at great length. And then, just to pick up a point that you mentioned, then they'll sort of get a little worried that maybe you're a little confused, and they'll say, it's just pretend. So it's not the case that they're confused at all, really. They understand it's pretend. It doesn't mean they don't love that imaginary friend, all that sort of thing. And with respect to the imagination, I think this is one form where we see the imagination at work, and it's something that's out there, you can look at it, measure it, that sort of thing. But the imagination I think of as much more global, just like Paul does, and the fact that it's involved in causal reasoning and moral reasoning and counterfactual, all these sorts of things, language, all of this involves imagination. So pretend play is something we can look at.
I think it's a very interesting sort of historical and cultural artifact. At the moment that people began to seriously attribute to small children an internal and representational capacity, play, both in Freud and in Piaget, was settled on as sort of the manifestation of that. And we sort of plowed that furrow since then. But it is the reason why I brought the Knight and the Brooklyn Bridge. While they are small things, they aren't really about toys, and they aren't really about narrative. They're about imagining a physical world that could operate in a way that you see possibilities in. It's also the Ikebana point. And I think we've got much too narrow a view. Or I was also thinking, when you spoke of sort of moral and spiritual imagination, if you think, in New Orleans at the moment, there are contesting visions, imaginations of how and what should be brought back. And those are created, projected visions of what a city might be. If you're a hotel developer, it's clean, it's upper middle class. If you lived in the Ninth Ward, it's a city that actually paid attention to you and your children. But those are paracosmos right there. And they're about a social and an ethical imagination, a civic imagination.
This morning, Oliver was discussing possibilities that one imagines adopting and one's emotional reactions to those envisaged possibilities. So I'm going to turn to Oliver and ask him to ask a question.
I was going to say something about mirror neurons after Miriam, which is something, if I can fit in what you were mentioning earlier. In the earliest mirror neuron discoveries are all about the imitation of action, and there is, of course, a big literature on that in relation to empathy. But there's increasing evidence that there's similar classes of empathy neurons, if you want, elsewhere in the brain, especially in relation to emotion. And when you were giving your example of the Super Bowl in American football and people imagining themselves into the players, it's equally true that people imagine themselves, for example, into soap operas and into the theatre. So I mean, it's not merely a mechanical thing. And that resonated a little, I think, with for example, Ed's patient that you mentioned earlier. It seems to me that what's interesting about the relationship between these children and their imaginary friends, for example, in the earliest years and what they grow up into is not the sort of ephemera of the particular object which they choose or the particular name, but the affective continuity. And Ed's patient is a perfect example of that. I mean, he's found ways of designing his world that are in common. But he doesn't have to have chosen the ring cycle as an adult. No doubt a different set of cultural circumstances would have produced a different class of obsession. But he wants control, he wants to be in charge, obviously. And, so it's that was sort of a grand observation I had in relation to that. I'm sorry that wasn't the prompt that you were offering. But it's the question that I wanted to the observation.
Question here and then there, yes.
One problem with children's imagination, I think, is how it tests our imagination. For instance, I can imagine when Luke says, it's more than I can understand. In a way, he's saying, I won't understand it. And somebody in your position could be thinking, maybe you should suggest something else. I know a little boy, I know he's a brilliant artist. I asked him the other day if I could Xerox this drawing that he made. It would be all right with you if I do? He said, no, it wouldn't. I said, well, you said I can't? He said, no. I said, no. I said, okay, I won't then. But I think it would be important if you think about why you don't want me to copy. This is a little boy I know is pretty disturbed. He called me up then a couple days later and said, I figured it out. The reason I don't want you to copy it is I'm afraid it'll break it down into pieces. Now I know he's thinking about himself. But anyway.
I got all lost in associated to, I mean, I think when you started your sentence, when you said how much they challenge our imagination, I mean, that's so true. You know, when he would become incredibly violent, I mean, I haven't told you the 1/18th of it. I found for a number of months that I would start to hyperventilate almost when I knew he was coming, and he'd come into the room and my heart would start to race because and he was so close to violence. I mean, he actually threw an animal at me and threw Tiny, actually, guess who, and hit me accidentally right in the eye, and I had, for a number.
Maybe on purpose.
Well, yeah, sure, of course. But at that moment, he didn't consciously mean to, I mean, and he was so regretful and frightened that he'd hurt me. And in fact, I had, shadows and, all those things that you have when you get hit badly in the eye for quite a while afterwards. And then I think about the times when he would suddenly shift the play, and suddenly Sean and Arietta, he said to me the other day, he said, let's go back and remember when we first met. Thank God. And I sit right down on the floor with him and I say, let's have a picnic, and then I'm right with his imagination and I'm not threatened. In fact, we only stayed there for a few minutes before we were fighting again, of course. But yeah, I mean, I completely... And what I think happens so often, I think this happens really very often with disturbed children, very disturbed children, is they deaden your imagination. Mm-hmm. That I've tried so many ways over these 3 years to get out of this groove and jump at any moment when he opens it up a little bit. But after a while, I stopped trying,
I don't know if it's deadened. In a way, it's how we respond. they didn't do it to us. We did because of being uncomfortable with what their imagination expresses.
Right. Absolutely.
Does he think you expect him to be violent?
I mean, I have students that like one little girl, when I tuned the violin the first time, she thought it was really funny sounds and just started giggling. And then every lesson when I start tuning her violin, she oh, you know, and then she put on this artificial laugh. The first time it was automatic. And after that, it was like she thought that I expected her to laugh when I tuned the violin. And that lasted quite a while. And eventually, she gave up on it. But I was wondering if something is that repetitious that this child might think that this is associated with you. Oh, this is, you know, tiny. This is time to be violent.
Well, in some ways, yes, but I don't think that he thinks that that's what I think if anything, he knows how much I wish he wouldn't do it.
I mean, if he's reading anything from me, he's probably at this point reading how much I wish he wouldn't do it. And in fact, is probably getting some sadistic pleasure out of upping the ante, you know, when he's got me most uncomfortable.
Yes, please.
Could it be that his parents need treatment that maybe... They do. I'm sure they do.
I thought I'd never crossed my mind.
He has nowhere to go. I mean, that there's only... that he can't be receptive or responsive to play or to achieving anything or as long as he's young, he's dependent. So it can only be circular and repetitious unless that environment
I've said this to them in concrete ways. You know, they have both been in treatment at various times during this period. I think they both have managed to get into treatments that only reify their positions. But I certainly have recommended treatment. I've sent them to a mediator. I've met with them alone, together, you know, all trying. I completely agree that he can't go anywhere as long as they are stuck. I mean, I totally agree. But, you know, this is, I think, the reason I presented this case is really to illustrate how the imagination gets colonized and stunted in a situation like this, where his imagination, I truly think, has been invaded in such a destructive way by this situation, and to God knows what long-term end. I mean, if he could transmute it in the way your patient had, eventually that would be great. I don't see it happening because it's been so relentless and they can't stop.
Don't lose hope.
Wagner's out
I thought your question was actually a really good one. You know, I think that maybe it's a lack of our imagination that we're seeing play as imagination. You know, and I'm not a neuroscientist, but I bet if you put adults playing with words and doing other things through the PET scanner, the same areas would light up that light up when children play. And I'm not sure that the role of imagination becomes less important as we get older. And I think that's what you were addressing, trying to open up the area of imagination as it, you know, is important in adults as well. We sort of focused on the play a lot.
I mean, one of the things that strikes me is that when kids at all exhibit the productive forms of imagination, how affiliative it is, how it draws people to them. It's a shared world, it's jointly constructed. And that when kids either can't, because of the sorts of circumstances, what a real loss it is for kids. I mean, in my particular work, I know it from kids who live in violent urban circumstances. Different than Luke, perhaps, but the imagination is colonized and stunted for them too. And one of the things is that they, in its being stunted, they, when they enter school, when they enter preschool, are seen as unimaginative kids and as less human, as less inventive. And it's at enormous cost to them long term not to be seen in those ways. So we see it in an individual therapeutic situation, but I think as a culture, we also have to own up to the fact that this kind of imaginative activity is helped to flourish and nurtured in a very particular band of children. and that it is oftentimes a luxury of being middle class, upper middle class, mainstream, and that it's not only individual variation, but also class and access variation about who gets to have an imagination.
Yes, please.
I'm curious about your opinions about the relationship between how we as adults perceive what is good or productive imagination or therapeutically healthy play and imagination, how that influences the way children play sometimes. There's a story in the New Yorker about a boy who's assessed at a very young age with an IQ of 179, and so he's labeled as extraordinarily gifted and talented. And so there's this template that adults have created, and my sense is that he begins to play in a way that fits into that template. He produces a CD when he's 9 years old, and he takes his own life when he's 14. Because there's, I think, for him maybe a disconnect between what he's experiencing and then this template that he's being held to. And I thought of that also with the violin story, because one is a spontaneous moment of play, and then later moments of play or use of imagination is reaction to an expectation, which is created by how we perceive what is positive imagination or stunted or healthy. I was just wondering if there's exploration of that in fields.
Marjorie, do you want?
Well, I've been really interested in how parents react to the creation of an imaginary friend, because some parents think it's great. They think, oh, my child is so creative and brilliant, and she's going to grow up and do something wonderful. And other parents are thinking, well, gee, I hope she goes out of it. I'm just not going to, do too much with it, find out too much about it. And some parents are saying, well, what is she missing in her life that she has to invent this friend? And then other parents think that maybe she's in touch with the devil. I've had people say that. So it's so extreme. Like, I've had people say that they pray for the devil to leave their child because she has an imaginary friend. And then so there's a huge variation. And this also varies as a function of culture. So I've been interested, okay, we have this variety of opinions, and how does that match up with what the children are doing? And basically, children pretend anyway. So they may not tell their parent about it. They may hide it in some ways. And I think this is in social play. Shlomo Ariel talks about this in a book about how children having a pretend game away from the parents. So you see it. There is an impulse to act out the things you're thinking about, and I think that parental approval promotes it, but parental disapproval doesn't extinguish it.
One of the other areas in terms of that struck me when thinking about imagination was, and it was a cognitive study that always goes down for me as one of my favorites. Somebody went into a classroom of a grade 5 classroom and said to all the kids, okay, I'm going to give you a math test. So they gave the kids a math test, and they say, okay, now I'd like each of you to think about who does the best in math in this class. Who's really our star mathematician? And all of the kids said, Paul always gets, A's on every test. And they said, okay, we're going to give you the test again, but this time instead of thinking about, do it as if you were Paul. Imagine, just for the time of taking this test, that you were Paul writing the test. And across the board, the kids got 15 points more. Right? They imagined that they were the smartest kid in the class, and then they performed that way, which was reminiscent of the story in the other direction with that. And so thinking about imagination and what it can release, as compared to Luke, where the imagination is cramping, constraining, that there are ways in which we can perhaps explore the way in which imagination can, have the mind flourish in that way.
Well, I just would like to add to that, sitting here, hearing imagination going around and around, as we all have second tracks going while we're sitting in a room, and I find myself imagining all these things that I might do that would be imaginative. I don't know exactly how to say it, but I'm thinking, oh, I want to go to the museum, and I want to start that quilt, and I want to, you know, and it's just the act of even thinking about imagination and its role and its function, I find, has, you know, sort of been generative. Now, whether I'll make anything is another question, but you know what I'm saying? That it sort of...
But I just add a footnote, which is that, as I was trying to stress earlier, the imagination is also used by children, or their imagination is used to get to grips with what the adult world regards as real. So there is allegedly a particular narrative about American history which children use their imagination to get a grip on. There is allegedly, in particular cultures, particular narratives about what happens to us when we die, which children take to be real, but of course they can't engage with it except via their imagination. There is a particular narrative about the origin of species, and of course there's competition in this country about which narrative should prevail. But it seems to me it's important to realize that the imagination is not just used to explore what is deemed to be fictional, it's also used to explore what is deemed to be factual. We had another question there.
Well, I'm just wondering about the difference between this kind of imagination, the several kinds in childhood that we're talking about, and later adulthood. One can imagine, I don't know this, I'm not thinking scientifically, but one can imagine a childhood play is continued into adulthood in the form of a conversation, a narrative, certainly in treatment, that's it. What if you just take the specific form of transformative imagination that goes into that short early period where children are delighted to invent metaphors, physical metaphors, and ask in what way that gets transmitted or doesn't into adulthood, and why some people, perhaps, you know, especially graphic artists and so on, why they would retain more of it. I just wonder if there are any ideas among you about where that reappears or why it disappears, you know, the turning a cup over and pretending it's a house or whatever, and the delight in that kind of, that particular, specific, transformative, make-believe discovery, with the gleefulness that goes along with it and so on. If there's any guess about understanding about why that disappears or where it reappears in adulthood of certain people.
Dennie, do you want to take that up?
Well, it's somewhat tangential, but one of the things I was thinking about is how important that is in parenthood. Both for nurturing that in children, but also for recognizing their capacity for an independent imagination from your own. So it's actually a very important resource in terms for individuation. They could think of something so different. And particularly, you know, the resonance that it has for a parent, you know, seeing a young child of your own see the trail of a jet and saying, oh, look, the sky has a scar. It is an enormous resource for understanding the separateness and for appreciating that. So that's not, I think, exactly where you were going, but I think it's one preservation, one real resource for in parenthood for that kind of individuation.
I did a study for my dissertation, and one child was very. His mother was really He was incredibly well adapted and flexible and imaginative, and she really welcomed that about him and welcomed his autonomy. And he was certainly, of our kids in our group, the first person to come in and say, you know, with a piece of clay, it's a hot dog, now it's blueberry pie, you know, that's hamburger. And, you know, she just thought this was great, you know. And, you know, so I think it's so much, and then there's a film that, you know, some of you may have seen of a mother-infant psychotherapy called I want to say bringing down the house, but that's not it. But it'll come to me. But and the mother, in this case, the child is pretending to feed her, and this is a child with an eating disorder, and the child goes something like, "It's cake," or "It's spaghetti," and she says, "Oh, we don't want to eat spaghetti. Let's make it porridge." And the mother will not engage until the child makes it porridge, which is the healthy food that mother wants this child to eat, not, And of course, all the therapists or the people watching the tape are going, "Oh my God, let her, But just that willingness to kind of invest in that on the mother's part, and how, freeing that is to the child.
I think at least some people argue that the appreciation of art is directly related to symbolic play. Like there's some philosophers like Kendall Walton who says that. So that would be an example that at least one person believes shows the same impulse and really directly related, to answer your question.
Before Paul wraps up the meeting tonight, I wonder if Bob wants to say something from his experience.
A lot of things. To explain who we are, Ellen and I, I'm Bob Kaplan. Began the math circle at Harvard in 1994. Our students range in age from 3.5 to 7. We take anyone who comes. We do real mathematics with them. We don't teach them anything. We give them one problem for a semester and let them loose on it. A key point, and this I think addresses what you were saying, Paul, is that because it's a collegial rather than a competitive undertaking, because there are no expectations put on them, because they come from different venues and find themselves among people of their own age whom they don't know, they each become what the world recognizes as mathematical geniuses, although they aren't so distinguished in their schools. Some of them dread math, some of them love it. But their imaginations, if that's the right word, are free to explore a topic together by pushing it around. But that's, I think, tangential to what I really want to say, which is that both in last night's slightly ill-tempered discussion and the marvelously well-tempered discussion today, the word imagination and the word play have been used in so many different ways. I think there's a real danger here, and I have a suggestion for a way to perhaps guard against this danger, which is, to use the word imagination myself, to distinguish between the geometric and the algebraic imagination, which is this. And the geometric, this touches on something that Ed said last night. You're picturing something, as each of us is probably picturing the imagination, almost as a physical capacity in the mind. In algebra, one does something very odd. One goes out of one's way not to picture. One calls the thing that one's trying to solve for X. And one puts it in a context where you solve for it. And I think it might be interesting to treat imagination as the X that we're trying to solve for, and find the right context, or probably contexts, in which to put it, where we can begin to solve for it, find out what this thing is, how it relates to play, the thing that's coming today, how it relates, this imagination, in children and in adults. Does it develop? Is it there all the time? Kant's a priori. Is it something we develop? Is it synthetic? Is it a combination of the two? But looking at it, I think there are very specific ways one could do this, both with children, with adults, in mathematics and in art, putting imagination itself, this X, on trial in a way, or at least under the microscope, where we bring to it, but keep on hold, our own ideas about what this imagination is, and try to see how it's playing itself out.
I think that was what was happening when you were saying that we wanted to talk about imagination and we ended up talking about play. Because that's such an instantiation. And you say, God knows what imagination is, but at least that kid had a truck and treated it one way. And I think also we're very confused even about play, in that therapeutic play is supposed not to be fiction, but in a way to reveal some metaphysical
true thing, so that you can say, I mean, if you're going to use something diagnostically, you don't want it to be a made-up joke. It has to have a truth to it. And yet, when these people are telling stories, they're using techniques of fiction. The breadcrumbs of Hansel and Gretel appear. So all the children I've known, and it's getting to be a rather large number, have from the moment that they can talk known the difference between fact and fiction, have all the sort of literary tropes of irony and exaggeration out there. I mean, once they can put three words together, they can do something fictional with those three words. So your question of how does one get from a child story to an adult author's relation to a fictional character? There's a lot of combined development I think going on. This is happening in us steadily. We don't have these nice stages that are in the book.
Well, on that open-ended note, let me say thank you to Arietta.